Biblical Figures in Islam, Part 31, New Testament, the Apostles, Part 2, the Historical Arguments. For Christians, one interesting and arguably very frustrating pattern from the Quran is when it is borrowing or confirming or acknowledging something from Christianity, and then giving that thing that was borrowed, confirmed, or acknowledged in Christianity, then giving it a completely new meaning that is wholly unknowable to Christians. And that's not a criticism per se. A Jew could make similar arguments about Christian beliefs regarding things like the Messiah, the throne of David, the interpretations of certain Jewish laws as the religion spread to the Gentiles, and many other things. But the pattern is definitely there, often, and it can be immensely frustrating. We went over the disciples in the previous episode. The Quran acknowledges the disciples and then, from a Christian perspective, goes on to completely disregard everything they preached and eventually died for. And there are plenty of other examples of this kind of thing I'm talking about. The Gospels, for example, they are acknowledged, but not in any form a Christian would actually recognize. They are portrayed almost as some sort of holy book that God sent down to Jesus. And the crucifixion is recognized, sort of, but given a mysterious set of events or non events that just make no sense to Christians. Even the Quran itself, the name Quran is borrowed from the Christian lectionary, but it doesn't resemble anything in that giant book that they read in church on every Sunday. And in these new versions given by the Quran, there is never a very detailed explanation as to why the change was made or why the new information is better than the old information, if there's an explanation at all. Here's another example. Why is Jesus called Isa in the Quran? That name never existed before the Quran. The Arabic word for Jesus was, previously, Yeshua. Now, does that mean anything? I don't know. So speculation swirls. Is it theological? Is there some significance to the name Isa being basically, when you actually look at the consonants, it's the Hebrew version of Jesus spelled backwards? Is this an attempt to take the Christian meaning out of the name, which, with much theological significance, originally means God saves? Is this a theological statement about Jesus dying for people's sins? Or is it just a random quirk that adds to the mystery, like those famous disjointed letters at the beginning of certain surahs? Or is it as simple as an early typographical error that just sort of stuck and nobody knows and no one will ever know? This is the kind of ambiguity I'm talking about. So when later Muslim theologians try to systematize these things regarding Christianity and to learn more about Christianity, it can be an impossibly complex puzzle to try and piece together, to turn into some coherent whole. Think about it. In the Quran, we don't even know why Jesus is called Jesus. And the Quran isn't of much help in saying why its version of Jesus is correct either. The Quran just kind of declares it. It's left for later scholars to try and figure out the why and all the other details. Now you see the same thing with the disciples, just still our subject here. In the last episode, we went over the sort of logic box that the Quran dropped on would-be Islamic apologists in the future. A box that they have been put in without any clear way of how to get out of it. Because this is the same pattern I'm talking about here, and the same mystery and ambiguity. If you're a Muslim and you're looking for a reason that the Christian version of Jesus and the Christian version of the disciples, a reason why these are incorrect. You're looking to the Quran and it's not there. There is no systematic argument against the Bible in the Quran, just declarations. And, from a Christian perspective, wild misunderstandings. And this brings us back to the apostles. If the Quranic version of Jesus is correct and the biblical version is incorrect, how can you build that theologically, historically? Well, given the box we have discussed here, Jesus can't be wrong, and the apostles, who basically wrote the New Testament, they can't be wrong either. So, how did Christians come to believe a gospel that is, Islamically speaking, wrong? The only out that I see, and has been not coincidentally the traditional Muslim argument, is that the text was corrupted at some point. Jesus was honest, and the apostles were honest, yet somehow the message all of them conveyed has just not made it to us in the present day. And given the limits of Islamic belief, this is the argument that I think just has to be made on the Islamic side. You don't really have much of a choice. Even if the details of this are kind of ad hoc, there is no official explanation. Just theories that because of the religious fact, if you're a Muslim, that the Quran cannot be wrong, then, well, what are you left with? History has to be wrong. Now, pinpointing that point where history became wrong is exceptionally difficult, if not impossible. Who broke the chain? If not the apostles, then who? Why is the current gospel attributed to the disciples? Why is it invalid? And when did it become invalid? Why can't Muslims use it? Where exactly did the gospel message, as Muslims believe, where did it get corrupted? That is an extremely important subject, at least for Christians when weighing the Islamic version of Jesus. But it's a topic that has never been addressed with the seriousness I think it deserves. And one reason may be that, from a Muslim perspective, this is just really, really difficult stuff. Jesus makes his divinity pretty clear in the Gospels. So, using Islamic logic, those Gospels must be wrong. But why are they wrong? Well, if the original disciples were righteous men, clearly the people transmitting the message changed it. But the gospel was being transmitted through the disciples, and they were good men, righteous men, honest men, and men who most definitely would have feared God way too much to change the message. There would be no motivation for them to change the message either, to lie. I mean, for what? To be horribly murdered for a lie and then go to hell for disobeying God? It's just really hard to reconcile that. So, Islamically, the actual process of the corruption of the gospel has always been unclear. And this is a major reason why. Still, this is a fascinating process nonetheless, for Muslims, for Christians, for unbelievers, to just follow this line of thinking through to its logical conclusion, to really ponder the Quranic claims here about the historicity of Christianity and of the New Testament, and by extension, the disciples responsible for it or not responsible for it. Again, if Jesus did not corrupt the message, and his apostles did not and cannot have corrupted the message, lest the Quran be incorrect, who did corrupt the message? How and when? This major of an error, particularly in the mind of a current Christian, is something that just absolutely has to be addressed and needs some kind of explanation. This corruption, logically, would have to be the generation after Jesus' apostles, based on what the Quran keeps saying about the reliability and the faith of the apostles. Now, if Jesus wasn't captured in the Gospels, if Jesus' true nature was not captured in the Gospels, what went wrong? The canonical Gospels clearly have an apostolic origin, meaning they came from the apostles. It's the reason only 4 Gospels made it into the canon in the first place. They're basically the witness of Matthew and John and Peter through Mark and Paul through Luke. Now, we'll get to Paul in a while and in a later episode. But for the 12, the people who knew Jesus from the earliest points of the New Testament, they clearly believed Jesus was the Son of God and testified to the resurrection. In the earliest dated gospel, at least the earliest written gospel, this would have been an oral tradition long before that anyway. Mark has Jesus going around forgiving sins, for example. That's something only God can do. Now, this sort of nature of Jesus was made far, far more explicit in John, for example, later on, but you can see it even in the earliest Testament, Peter through St. Mark. And Peter, obviously, would be one of the Islamic righteous. Let's say you don't believe Mark or Matthew, or you think John wasn't actually written by John. Okay, if that's true, maybe you have something to build on here, a possible break from the disciples and things that were written in their name. If I'm an Islamic Gospels detective, that's precisely the place I'd zero in on. But, admitted Christian bias here, this line of inquiry pretty much dies where it starts. Because Christian claims about Jesus are not limited to the Gospels. There are the epistles, letters from apostles. There are those. And in addition, there's just plain boring non-religious history to consider. There is just plain old basic secular history of the disciples that point to them preaching the message of the Christian gospel. For example, look at the Council of Jerusalem. This was 15 or so years after Jesus' crucifixion. And Paul, again, we'll get to Paul in detail later. Paul was going all over Asia Minor and the Greco-Roman world, preaching about Jesus' divinity and the resurrection and everything you will see in modern Christian theology. And yet, what was the topic of this council, this meeting in Jerusalem of the biggest of the big kahunas of the early church? James and Peter and John and Paul. What did they get together to discuss that was just so all fired important? What was this pressing matter? Well, circumcision, basically, and whether Gentiles had to keep kosher. I mean, really, that's it. But why is that important? Because I tend to infer here the apostles who knew Jesus had no problem with anything that Paul was doing. They just gave him some dietary guidelines and decided, after some debate, that, you know what, circumcision is not necessary for Gentiles. And then you can bring this back to the Islamic version of the righteous disciples, right? Because Peter or James, I mean, really almost about anybody that was at this place would have the stamp of approval of the Quran. These are the righteous disciples. And so this sort of gives Paul the stamp of approval of the 12, the men portrayed as honest and righteous in the Quran. Now, Paul and James also had some disagreements, just like Paul and Peter, but the nature of Jesus wasn't really one of them. Like, here's another example. Paul came back to Jerusalem after about 7 years, I think, and he had another similar conversation. Now, the Jerusalem church wasn't happy about Paul giving, implicitly or explicitly, giving a message to the more Hellenized Jews. Those are Jews that were just super enmeshed in the Greek world. And he was telling them that they did not need to follow the Mosaic law. Not that the Greeks had to do those things, really, but the Jews did, Hellenized or not. Remember, these are not Greeks. They may look like Greeks, they may talk like Greeks, but they're not Greeks. They are Jews. So the idea that Paul was telling Jews to abandon the law was causing a major scandal back in Jerusalem. That is, while it still had a Jewish population. Now, the Romans would change that shortly thereafter, unfortunately. But Paul and the Jerusalem church came to an agreement, and Paul accepted its authority and went back to preaching Pauline Christianity, so to speak, to the Greco-Roman world. But again, what was the main disagreement here? It's nothing about Jesus' divinity, just a desire to continue to keep the Jewish-Greek distinction as the church grew. And what makes this stuff about Paul so important historically is the very, very early historical date of Paul's letters, which, again, historically, in a secular sense, no one disputes in terms of authenticity or timing or content. The timing is what is critical here, and a difficult hurdle for Muslim theologians, or say Muslim gospel detectives, as I put it earlier. It's just another difficult thing to have to consider because Paul's letters even predate the Gospels, and they are the earliest version we have of what you would call a systematic Christology, a definition of who and what specifically Jesus Christ really was, or is, or will be. What you believe is obviously up to you, but I believe the apostles who knew Jesus definitely believed Jesus was divine, that they believed what the church teaches today. After all, Peter, the rock, so Peter and Paul, they went to Rome together long after the kerfluffle about circumcision. Peter and Paul were apostles with the same beliefs on the same mission. It's just so hard to imagine they would disagree about something as fundamental as Jesus' divinity, and that this somehow would not be known in the many years that they spent together. So this leaves those creating an Islamic version of the apostles with a perplexing question. Peter cannot be wrong. That would be un-Islamic. You can say Paul was wrong, and his influence created Trinitarian Christianity. That's not impossible. Some Muslims make exactly this argument that it was Paul's fault. I just find that extremely unlikely, given the historical record. I mean, not impossible, I suppose, but not even close to likely. And again, we'll get to Paul in more detail later. But Islamically speaking, remember, Christianity had to be corrupted somewhere down the line. It had to have happened at some point before the ecumenical councils codified all those things so explicitly. But then again, those councils and the creeds that came out of them, they are clearly based on the beliefs of the apostles, right? So it's really hard to find a disconnect. So you're an Islamic detective and you're trying to track down the gospel code, and you just have to figure out, where was this link severed? If it definitely wasn't Peter and the 12, and if it probably wasn't Paul, that leads us more in a third direction. The apostles were the victim of some kind of mass historical forgery. That's how you can reconcile the Islamic Jesus with the righteousness of the apostles. And that forgery would have to include Paul's letters, the epistles, the synoptic gospels, and all that. So it's an extremely, massively high hill to climb. Not impossible, but still wildly difficult. So what I keep getting at here is the Quran really, really boxed in Muslim theologians on this one. Because if you believe the Quran is the word of God, you also have to believe the disciples were righteous men. It's a very, very small space in which to operate. So if you believe the Christians are wrong about Jesus, you have to attack the historical chain somewhere between Jesus and the current Nicene Creed believing church. And the 12 apostles, like I said, they're already off limits, Islamically speaking. The window for historical speculation here is so short. If you were to make an argument that the apostles were right and the church was wrong, it's a short window with very limited options. Now, really, it would have to be somewhere between Paul writing his letters and the written form of the Gospel of Mark. And that's just a few years. And Paul's letters would have to be forgeries, or the 12 apostles' objections to Paul's blasphemies would have had to have been hidden. And when the Gospels were finally written down, they were Paul's corrupted version of them. And the living disciples did not object, or at least were silenced somehow. Remember, John, the beloved, he lived for nearly a century. So he, among the righteous disciples of Jesus, he would have had to have been silenced too. Again, extremely narrow gate here. Or if all that is just a little too difficult, you just can't quite thread that needle, there is another possibility. You could just try to retcon the entire thing. Retcon means go back in the story and just change something. Retroactive continuity is what it means. To go back in the story and say, nope, from now on, this is what happened here. In pop culture and like comic books and movies, this is done with little or no explanation, just a declaration that this is the new version of things. Now, you could do that too. As in, hey, everybody, powerful forces ended up making up the whole thing and rewriting the history to suit the new Nicene version of Christianity. And that is a tough argument to make. But given the options available to a Muslim theology of the apostles, it's probably the strongest one, at least in my opinion. It's unprovable, but it makes a bit more sense than the idea that Peter and the 12 just kind of forgot about the real Jesus and were okay with Paul spewing blasphemy across the Roman Empire, or that Paul managed to muster enough powerful forces to cover up the objections of the disciples, to erase them from history. There's one other thing to consider in all this to kind of pick your favorite option, if you would. One other thing to kind of keep in mind about the apostles is that these were not men with power. That's a huge difference between the disciples and Muhammad's companions. This might be more believable, this whole historical conspiracy. If you made a similar accusation using Umar or Uthman or even Ali, they were emperors. They could command the forces needed to do this. Maybe. Now, one could, if you want to put on a conspiracy hat, you could imagine Islamic emperors retconning history and changing the Quran too. They might have the power to do that. There are still some less than mainstream historians who actually make this argument, even to the point, which I think is a little nuts. Maybe they're smarter than me, but some of them even say Muhammad never actually existed. I don't buy that. I think it's tinfoil hat stuff and historic conspiracy, but it's out there. And even if you give such things serious consideration, really, I don't think such a wild project would actually succeed, but it would have a much better chance of success than some of the Islamic theories about Christianity and Constantine, for example, that he basically did that very thing. erasing centuries of history in a completely undetectable fashion. Now, if true, I mean, any of these things would be the most fantastic, most epic conspiracy in the history of the world, be it the disciples or the companions. So, like I said, in a from a historical standpoint, you can see why the Islamic relationship with the apostles and everything that came after the apostles that became Christianity, it's really complicated. The disciples were righteous men with the fear of God. The Quran is clear on that. So, did they lose their faith? Was it the generation after them that screwed up? Did they change the Gospels? Did they change the epistles, the letters from the apostles? Was it some kind of grand Greek conspiracy? Again, like I said, it's complicated and unclear. I mean, to an extreme degree. And probably not coincidentally, this whole thing, all these things we're talking about here, these are not really codified things within Islam. There's not a definitive answer here on the Islamic side as to why the Christians are wrong, why the Gospels are wrong, why, these things that are traced to the apostles, why these are wrong, why Paul was wrong. It's just taken as an article of faith, which of course isn't unreasonable if you're a believing Muslim. I mean, after all, for the Quran to be true, then Christians have to be wrong, at least a little. But that faith obviously is not super persuasive to non Muslims and to Christians because the specifics are just not there. And the specifics that come from later theologians are, again, from a non Muslim perspective, they're not terribly convincing or they sound conspiratorial. And you can tell. It just doesn't seem to have been a historical project that Muslims have ever really focused on. It's kind of like the Islamic apocalypse that we went through um, probably years ago now. You have broad assertions that are made, and the details, they're up to you. When Muslim theologians talk about the Gospels, what happened, all this sort of thing, and the apostles, it usually goes something like the disciples followed the teaching of Jesus even after his death. Unfortunately, over time, the true message of Jesus and the faith of the disciples was discarded and forgotten. How did that happen? Well, nobody knows. If you're a Muslim, you just have to trust God on that one. When did it happen? Well, eventually, sometime before Muhammad. Who did it? Just pick your historical villain, just as long as it's not one of the 12 disciples, because of what the Quran says about them. Now, why did this happen? Well, that's even a bigger mystery, a huge mystery, one that cannot be explained, regardless of whether the explanation is being sought by a Muslim or a Christian. Thank you, and I'll talk to you next time. Inshallah.